Gives me a great pleasure to introduce both Dennis Nurkse and Carolyn Forché to you today. Dennis will be reading first. Dennis Nurkse is the author of 12 books of poetry, most recently Love in the Last Days, a fascinating retelling of the Tristan and Isolde myth with a timely feminist twist at the end, and a new and selected collection of poems titled A Country of Strangers, both from Knopf. What distinguishes all of Dennis Nurkse's poems is his remarkable gift for what John Keats called negative capability. The ability to immerse oneself in uncertainty, mystery, doubt, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. This transpersonal talent endows him with an extraordinary ability to write powerfully spare lyrical poems in which his speakers exercise an accurate empathy that evokes the vivid life of the other. He has staked out his own personal territory in both private and public ways in the various places and countries he has lived or written about. From Brooklyn, where he was the poet laureate of the entire city of Brooklyn, to El Salvador, to France, to Vermont, to England, to Estonia. Unlike many of his colleagues, Nurkse, like one of Whitman's roughs, has worked in factories and lumber yards. He's also worked as a board member, or has served as a board member of Amnesty International, and as a teacher at Rikers Island and in programs for the underprivileged in New York City. He presently teaches poetry and poetry writing at Sarah Lawrence College. This dialectic between the real world and his study has inspired him to write close to the bone with immense particulars that are both deeply personal and universal at the same time. I'm struck by the unique distance from his own isolation that he establishes, that imbues his poetry with revelatory, compassionate witnessing that leads him in turn to ironic epiphanies about himself, as he declares so startlingly in the conclusion of his poem, Leaving Mary Magdalene, the hospital, I swept up the pennies in lint from the gleaming counter, afraid to say thank you, and walked through the winking lights, the heat shield, the self-opening gates, into those ice-encrusted streets where I first learned to be no one. Dennis Nurkse.
Charge, you're so kind. Can everybody hear me? And please, is that a no or a yes? Okay. Louder? Please, just raise your hand if you can't. My voice is a little shaky. I have a lot of allergies. Last time I did a reading, I asked people to let me know if they couldn't hear. And at the end, they said, that seemed like a very passionate reading, but we couldn't hear a word you said. And I said, why didn't you tell me? And they said, that would have been rude. So, I guess it was a good poetry reading. Nobody got hurt. Thank you, Chard, for that introduction. And excuse me for a slight vocal shakiness. It's not COVID, it's bad allergies. I'm thrilled to be reading with Carolyn Forché, who's really one of the benchmark poets of my generation, if not the benchmark poet. I'm going to be reading from A Country of Strangers, which is a new and selected. I'll start with a poem that's about 40 years old. Lamps and fences. When the dead came into power, at first we did not notice. The stars were a little brighter. There were more roaches. Wherever we walked, we killed something. Since it was involuntary, it happened as if in secret. In the bars, the prices were written in chalk. The musicians were too eager to finish, though they remained true to the old rage. When we made love, our thoughts turned to the hunted, and those turned back from the frontier. Though the frontier was only the meaning of a sound in a language that had mastered us. Small countries, a man and a woman are lying together, listening to news of a war. The radio dial is the only light in the room. Casualties are read out. He thinks, these are people I no longer have to love. And he touches her hair and calls her name, but it sounds strange to her, like a stone left over from a house already built. And this is an old Vermont poem from my wild youth, walking on the highway. Curving shoulder, freeway above Burlington, lights of a minor city, and north by Canada, no lights. Good luck is holy, and bad luck, the last town with its rabbit coops and one boutique. I've been traveling 5 years. I still come to places seen in dreams, but not often. Lamps of a sawmill and a maple sugar shop, almost dawn, no traffic, stars high and oblique. By my fruits I am known. The year 1940 has been on my mind. My parents met in 1940 on a boat out of Portugal. My dad was Estonian, my mom was French. They fell in love. She sang Lily Marlene to him in the moonlight. Then they took about 10 years working out whether to get married and have kids or not. You know, he wanted to, and she said, I'm not ready. And then she said, I'm ready. And he said, okay, I'm not ready. But anyway, I grew up with my parents talking about something called the big lie that spread through their societies and destroyed their societies just like that. 1913 Encyclopedia Britannica says that anti-Semitism was a deviation from the 18th century, only present in the deepest regions of Russia. And then suddenly, you had Hitler in Russia. You had a society that was on the defensive. My parents used to talk about that, but mainly not talk about that. And I think it was their not talking about that made me a poet and made me realize that there were very deep silences that were encoded in what people were telling each other. I think I also became a poet because my father died when I was 8, and I was very close to him, and I had told him nothing. And I remember the last time I saw him, he waved to me, but I was a cool little 8-year-old soccer player, playing left wing. So I wasn't going to wave back to this old dude in a tweed jacket. So I decided I would just give him a hug in the evening, and I never saw him again. And that made me feel that you kind of have to say what you want to say. In this life, you can't put too much of. So this poem is to my father. Childhood in the great cities. In the dim room, my father unpacks his books and sets them on the dusty shelf in order of weight. Marx, the Bible, the Atlas. He runs a finger along his knife-edge crease and coaxes his trousers onto the clasp hanger. He will not wake me. These sheets are stiff from honeymoon come. I turn to face the wall. Lovers moan inside the plaster. Now my father lies beside me and clasps his hands over his pale belly. In case I can read his mind, he dreams in his own language. We are still in the middle of the journey from Alpha to Omega, Petersburg to Los Angeles, workers' state to kingdom of God. Each city is larger than the last, each room smaller, each keyhole more dazzling. I tiptoe to the curtain and see a general on a stone horse, and moonlit slums, roofs crisscrossed by immense names, massed laundry, towers where every window is lit. After midnight, my father grunts softly not to wake me. Soon he begins talking in the old language, halting at first, then in a flood as tears come back to him. And I'll sit cross-legged until dawn to guard him from that stranger with whom he bargains in a terrified voice. The Book of Loneliness. Each night in the leather-backed chair, my father thumbs the gold-flecked pages. I peek over his shoulder. The letters are blurred with spiky curlicues, Hebrew or Greek. They twist like flames. Put it down, come play with me. In the new fallen snow, your huge boot will cave in my footprints until no one can find me. Or let me sit on your knee while you tell me stories of the war long ago. Among their million enemies, wasn't there one you killed? But my father's eyes never stray from the page. At bedtime, he just points to the tall black clock. And when I lie alone in the dark room, he will come kiss me and sing me the lullaby in a small, scared voice, as if it were his secret that I'll never see him again. My father at Pradesh. He has left his life with his baggage in the village. Now he walks by himself in the forest at Pradesh. A tiny sparrow with a fat chest hops up and considers him gravely. He's no longer the enemy. Under a clump of white mushrooms no one will harvest, he finds flowers with no names, a teardrop, a bead of blood. He stumbles on a hidden spring and sips a cold, rushing voice. And the remoteness of another planet. Now he can enter the wild hives and scoop that cloudy honey in both hands. And the one who was stung was a stranger, an exile. No war, no child, no suffering, only the waterfall in the fog. And here's a poem from my own time in history. Some of you will remember this, but this was the first time when I realized there was a conflict between my parents' life and the world, because I went to school and they told us, if there's a nuclear war, hide under your desk and count to 13. And my parents said, that is some crazy shit. This poem is called We Believed in the End of the World. We scrunched under the desk where we once memorized the lives of saints and heroes, while the teacher droned on, trying to stay calm in the face of a bomb that might never fall. In that rich dark, we learned how we fitted, boy and girl, how we were our opposites, and each our own opposite. Above us, the stashed gum of a generation of older brothers glinted amazingly hard. If we tried to carve a heart, that dark sheen cracked. We believed this world would end, like water from the fountain held in cupped hands, like chalk dust, or the powder from a jelly donut. Far away, the principal rumbled on his scratchy intercom. Then nothing, the powerful swish of traffic, silence, time passing, the pulse quickening as if to find a way out, and no world except us. Maybe I'll read a love poem after these poems. Late summer. When the rain woke me, I no longer knew and had to remind myself, this is darkness, that is the wine glass. This is the blowing curtain, that's the immense city. It's late in my life, but early in August. This is my wife, naked in my arms. I'm going to read a few more recent poems. This is a poem from the George Floyd moment. So strange that one would say George Floyd moment. It seemed at the time that the world was changing. The kids that I teach were out in the streets, and they were militia, they were boogaloo boys, they were strange people out there, and the kids that I taught were in danger. Of course, the people of color in this nation and planet were in danger. This poem is called Order to Disperse. Tonight, my children are facing live ammunition. One holds a rock, one brought a Bible, one hides a phone. The fires of the provocateurs burn so brightly. The police put duct tape over their badges. The soldiers are hooded. They wear no insignia. Last night they had rubber bullets. Tonight, hollow point. In the smoke you see the outlines of a bank, a cathedral. absent as the profiles of presidents on coins. A voice advances, a voice retreats, someone aims. Have you ever died in a dream? What happened then? Tell me what happened. There is only one life. How long will I hold mine, like water in cupped hands? I wrote that there is only one life, but I'm not sure whether that's true. This is a poem. Chard mentioned I used to teach at Rikers Island, and it was fortunate for me. I did a lot of teaching in strange places, and I understood poetry. I think Carolyn sees it this way also, as a force. I mean, it's not something that you go to school and get a little better at, and then you go to graduate school and get even a little bit better. It's a force that could destroy you. I remember teaching at Rikers Island and teaching poetry, and a kid says, I wrote a poem last night at 4 a.m., but I couldn't wake up and turn on the light because the guard would come. And another kid said, you did that? I did that too. You can't make this stuff up. And a third kid and a fourth kid, there were about 12 kids in the class. It's not that every one of them had written a poem that night, but 4 of them did, and they couldn't write it down because of the guard. And none of them will ever get any credit for it. The guard will always be there in their lives. There's a kid called Antonio Sabater who wrote a poem that, it starts out, I am just a number, the walls are closing in on me. Well, you feel, I've seen poems like that before. And then it ends, just the thought of me in someone else's mind gives me the chills. This poem is called The White Prisons. And I might as well dedicate it to that kid, Antonio Sabater. The kids ask, do you also teach in the white prisons? There are white schools, white libraries, white hospitals, churches, parks, and ball fields. Why wouldn't there be white prisons? Snow pulses in a tiny barred window, an idea at once vague and obsessive. The kids have been writing their poem. It starts with a blank page, a doodle in the margin, but soon you are a child in the streets. Oily slush seeps up through the soles of your Nikes. You pass a Burger King, Zion Redeemer, the ironworks under sleet. Pitkin Avenue does not go all the way to morning. The white Lexus appears out of nowhere. Where to turn? Icy stoops, steel-shod doors. I expect to live another 3 years, maybe 2 years and 6 weeks. 6 weeks and 7 days, probably to my 19th birthday. It happens every night in my mind. The long street, the hour before dawn, the white Lexus, my enemy's face in the tinted window, so familiar, so masked. I'm going to conclude with maybe one more poem. This is a poem to my daughter. I have to tell this story. I don't have to, I'm moved to. My nephew, when he was a little kid, was very depressed, and he felt life was meaningless and he had to do something definitive. So he decided he would be a brain surgeon. Then he kind of read up on that, and he saw there was a downside to being a brain surgeon. So he decided he would be a poet. And my daughter said, any fool can be a brain surgeon, but to be a poet, you have to have something to say. So this is for my daughter. It's called Showers. And my daughter was an extremely bossy kid. Now I have extremely bossy grandchildren. So it feels like there's some purpose to my life. Showers. The child tells me, put a brick in the toilet. Don't wear leather. Don't eat brisket, snapper, or farmed salmon. Not tells, orders. Doesn't she know the sluice gates were left open and 1 trillion gallons wasted just for the dare of it? Until the staring eye shares that thrill, confessing, I am just iris and cornea, blind spot where brain meets mind, the place where the image forms itself from a spark, image of the coming storm. But the child sits outside the bathroom with the watch she got for best diorama, muttering, 2 minutes too long. Half measures, I say. She says, action. I say, I'm just one man. She says, you're 7 billion. If you choose, the sea goes back. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. That was wonderful. Well, it gives me great pleasure now to introduce these two poets at the same reading. It's just such a privilege and joy. Carolyn Forché, Where to Begin? Carolyn Forché is the author of 5 books of poetry, most recently In the Lateness of the World. Both books, The Country of Strangers and this book, are on the back table. Penguin in 2020. There was a finalist last year for the Pulitzer Prize. Blue Hour, 2004, finalist for the National Book Circles Award. The Angel of History, 1995, winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Award. The Country Between Us, 1982, winner of the Lamont Prize for the Academy of American Poets, and Gathering the Tribe in 1976, winner of the Yale Younger Poets Prize. Her memoir, What You Have Heard Is True, a memoir of witness and resistance, Penguin 2019, won the Juan E. Mendez Book Award for Human Rights in Latin America and was a finalist for the National Book Award. Her anthology, Against Forgetting, which came out in 1993, was praised by Nelson Mandela as, quote, itself a blow against tyranny, against prejudice, against injustice. I cannot read this book without marveling at what beauty these writers have made of the calamity called the 20th century. I would not have thought a poetry anthology could be so stirring, end of quote. In 2019, Carolyn edited with Duncan Wu a follow-up to Against Forgetting called The Poetry of Witness, the tradition in England from 1500 to 2001, in English from 1500 to 2001. In 2020, she received the Wyndham Campbell Prize from the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University. In 1998, in Stockholm, she received the Adita and Ira Morris Hiroshima Foundation for Peace and Culture Prize. She has translated the poetry of Claribel Alegria, Robert Desnos, Mahmoud Darwish, and most recently, Fernando Valverde's Philippic America. She has been awarded fellowships from the National Endowment of the Arts, the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, the Lateness Foundation, and she's university professor at Georgetown University in Washington. In bearing witness to many of the most political evils over the past 5 centuries in her 2 anthologies of the Poetry of Witness, as well as in her own poetry, Forché has only grown more incisive, daring, emboldened, and important as a poet who has wed memorable speech to truth about what the poet Philip Larkin called man handing on misery to man in his poem, This Be the Verse. Like a modern-day Antigone, Forché has spoken, written, and edited truth to power in both her nonfiction and poetry books with a spare, courageous eloquence that Hilton Ailes of The New Yorker in a recent article on Carolyn summed up in this way, quote, "History, with its construction and its destruction, is at the heart of In the Lateness of the World. In it, one feels the poet creating a wave, a new wave that will crash onto new lands and unexplored territories," end of quote. This observation chimes with an eschatological tone and message. Yet, in this last stage of human history, she knows that Jeremiads aren't enough, that they need the complement of action and responsibility. In an interview I conducted with Carolyn, she concluded this way: "Witness is neither martyrdom nor the saying of juridical truth, but the owning of one's infinite responsibility for the other. It is not to be mistaken for a politicized confessionalism. In the Poetry of Witness, the poem makes present to us the experience of the other. The poem is the experience, rather than a symbolic representation. When we read the poem as witness, we are marked by it and become ourselves witnesses to what it has made present before us. Language incises the page, wounding it with testimonial presence, and the reader is marked by encounter with that presence. Witness begets witness. The text we read becomes a living archive." Please welcome Carolyn Forché.
I have my phone because I need a clock. It was thrilling to listen to Dennis. Thank you so much, and thank you for that introduction from both of us, Shao. It was really lovely. It's an honor to read here and to come back to Brattleboro, and thank you for coming. It's been a long time since we've had poetry readings like this. And we're in very difficult times, and I think poetry readings like this can help us. I'm going to begin with a poem that I wrote for Ilya Kaminsky, poet Ilya Kaminsky. He's from Ukraine, from Odessa in Ukraine, and he left as a teenager, came to the United States in exile with his parents, and in 2004, when he was still quite a young man, we went back to Ukraine together because I thought it would be a good idea for a young poet who had had to leave his country to go back and see it again. And it was, in some respects, a good idea, but as anyone knows who's even tried to go back to the town they grew up in, it has some drawbacks, going back and seeing it as it is not in your memory. This is called Exile, and I'm reading it for him because of the situation we're in right now with Ukraine. And Ilya did go back there this summer and went all the way to Moldova. I didn't approve, but he didn't listen to me. He had to do what he had to do. Exile. The city of your childhood rises between steppe and sea, wheat and light, white with the dust of cockle shells, stargazers, and bones of pipefish. City of limestone, soft enough to cut with a hatchet, where the sea unfurls and acacias brought by Greeks on their ships turn white in summer. So yes, you remember, this is the city you lost. City of smugglers and violinists, chess players and monkeys, an opera house, a madhouse, a ghost church with wind for its choir, where two things were esteemed, literature and ships, poetry and the sea. If you return now, it will not be as a being visible to others. And when you walk past, it will not be as if a man had passed, but rather as if someone had remembered something long forgotten and wondered why. If you return, your father will be alive to prepare for you his mint cucumber soup and give you the little sweet called bird's milk. And after hours of looking with him for his sandals lost near the sea, you visit again together the amusement park where your ancestors are buried, and then go home to the apartment house built by German prisoners of war, to whom your father gave bread, which you remember surprised you. You take the tram to a stop where it is no longer possible to get off, and he walks with you until he vanishes, still holding in his own your invisible hand. This next one is also for Ilya, but it's read at the request of Shal. And its title is Fisherman. Shal said, read the communion poem. This also takes place on the same journey, only this time we're in Russia, because Ilya wanted to visit the shrines of the silver poets in Petersburg, in St. Petersburg, Russia. So we went there to visit with the spirits of Akhmatova, Tsvetaeva, and Mandelstam. And we just walked the city. And the river is the Neva that runs through the city. Joseph Brodsky said that it was as if the river were filming the city as it passes through it, because all the buildings are upside down in the river, in their reflections. March. The Neva still white, crisp as communion, and as we walk its bridges, steadying ourselves on the glaze, tubes of ice slide from the gutter spouts to the astonishment of dogs, some of whom have not seen spring before, while others pretend not to remember, and a woman bends over her late potatoes, sorting and piling, and you say, In this house lived a friend of my father who was killed. And in that house lived another, and in this, a very bad poet, no longer known. We come to the synagogue and go in, as far back as a forgotten holiness, where we are told you can whisper into the wall and be heard on the other side. But the rabbi doesn't know you are deaf. We whisper into the wall to please him. A sign in Cyrillic asks for donations, and in exchange we apparently buy dozens of matzos wrapped in paper. There are only 100 of us left in the city. While we are here, a fisherman waits on the river, seated with a bucket beside him, his line in the hole. But in the last hour, water has surrounded his slab of ice, so unbeknownst he is floating downstream, having caught nothing, cold and delirious with winter thoughts, as they all are and were. And as for rescue, no one will come. It is spring, the neva, white and crisp as communion. I'm going to talk about another poet now. He is dead. His name was Daniel Simko, and he was from the same village as my family was from in former Czechoslovakia. And we became really good friends over the decades. He was a librarian in the New York Public Library. He translated poets. He was a beautiful translator of Georg Trakl, a volume called Autumn Sonata. But he wrote his own poems, but he always put them in drawers and boxes. He said they weren't good enough, they weren't finished, he wasn't ready, he wasn't going to publish them. And so after he died, I just went and got them all and brought out a book with Forché called The Arrival, which he had no say in about the arrangement or anything. So the poem is called The Lost Suitcase, and the reason is just after the Velvet Revolution, he and I decided we were going to go back. We were going because he had left some jazz records and books in an attic in Bratislava, and I had some family I wanted to find in Praha and Brno. So we were going to go, and we decided, let's fly to Vienna and rent a car and drive over the bridge to Bratislava. So this is how we decided to go. Only in Vienna, he had 2 suitcases, one with his normal things of traveling, the other was filled with books. I don't know whether he planned to just read his whole way through the trip or whether he was going to give these books away. But he was a smoker, as a lot of people were then, and he turned his back to, and this is the poem about what happened to the suitcase. The lost suitcase. So it was, with the suitcase left in front of the hotel, cinched, broken locked, papered with world ports, carrying what mattered until then, when turning your back to cup a match, it was taken. And the thief, expecting valuables, instead found books written between wars, gold attic light, mechanical birds singing, and the chronicle of your country's final hours. What, by means of notes, you hoped to become? A noun on paper, paper dark with nouns. Swallows darting through a basilica, your hands up in smoke, a cloud about to open over the city, pillows breathing shallowly where you had lain, a ghost in a hospital gown, and here, your voice, principled, tender, soughing through a fence woven with pine boughs. Writing is older than glass, but younger than music. older than clocks or porcelain, but younger than rope. Dear one who even in speaking is silent, for years I have searched, usually while asleep, when I have found the suitcase, open, collecting snow, still holding your vademecum of the infinite, your dictionary of the no longer spoken, a commonplace of wounds casually inflicted, and the slender ledger of truly heroic acts. Gone is your atlas of countries unmarked by war. Absent your manual for the preservation of ours. The incunabulum is lost, both your earliest book and a hatching place for your mechanical birds, but the collection of aperçus having to do with light laying its eggs in your eyes was found, along with the prophecy that all mass murders were early omens. In the antique bookshop, I found your catechism of atrophied faiths. So I lay you to rest without your psalter, nor the monograph wherein you state your most unequivocal and hard-won proposition. That everything must happen, but to whom doesn't matter. Here are your books as if they were burning. Be near now and wake to tell me who you were. I'm going to read a little new poem. Oh, thank you. This is called Translation, and it's also for Daniel. I lived in France for a year, and Daniel came to stay with us because he was translating Trockel then. And he would go off and translate at the cafe during the day. Well, because I had a new baby and he couldn't, it wasn't bad. Translation for Daniel. In a cafe near the entrance to the catacombs, you wrote your English versions of poems composed in the voice of a thrush in a cage. Winter trees, plane trees, iron benches, bocce in snow. This is where I found you most afternoons, cigarette lit, stack of books, folded up Le Monde, writing into the past with your oldest pen, unraveling your script, then rolling it up again. Music turned back into ink on paper, a symphony floating on the table, face down. I was a young mother pushing a carriage then, the little one trying to free himself, as he now has done, while behind the glass door of an armoire, armies of paper soldiers fought themselves, bells ringing like stones through the clouds, an army of graves upright. How to be still as you were, to keep quiet as one language enters another, leaving everything, all usual worlds behind. Because fog is not the same as violin. Fog is flute, and opera in time of war is still sung to the applause of silence. You wrote like a mole in its tunnel, dreaming of stars. I don't know, I guess because of the times we're in, I'll give you one more poem of Daniel, Last Bridge. When he was a boy, the Warsaw Pact countries invaded former Czechoslovakia in 1968 in September. August and September. And he was a kid, and he was with a gang of hoodlums, as he called themselves. They were all hoodlums. So they had the idea to turn all the street signs around or pull them up to get the Soviet army lost. And it sort of worked because the Soviet army accidentally pulled a few kilometers into Austria, nearly creating a situation with NATO. And then they hurriedly went back. But this was something he was very proud of in his life, that they had done this. And I address a really close friend of his at the end of his life. Last bridge. Adrianska, you were with him in his final hours, and I give you that. Speaking the language understood only in the kitchen of childhood. And for you, a lamp-lit tongue spoken in tomato gardens and prison camps by those sent away and those who let them be sent. So many words for no one and nothing until history came for them too, with its years of industry and waste, a tram pulling black smoke behind itself. These are the suitcases manufactured in communist times from balsa and tin. Here are the books, ink on vellum, sold by hoodlums on the black market. We must have crossed the bridge a dozen times those nights, but can you imagine? Alone, with no one from whom to borrow a match. There appeared a Russian deserter from Afghan war who drew caricatures for small change, but never drew our likeness. And some nights there was singing beneath stone angels, but we were otherwise alone. Svetko's memories were of the scent of garlic fields beside the river, and of riding in the basket of his father's bicycle along its banks. On the night of the invasion, there was a radio and red-starred jeeps that would become white-starred jeeps in the West. Svetko, with his friends, turned the street signs around, and by mistake, the enemy marched into Austria. So it is over, you tell me. When he closed his eyes, there were swans. You took his hand on the last bridge and made him laugh. You have my yes, Adrianska. I'm going to go somewhere else now. I need to go somewhere else, which is the lighthouse. I love lighthouses. I go to them wherever they are. And the problem with people who love lighthouses is that they want to go visit the lighthouse, but they don't want anybody else to be there. They want to be alone with the lighthouse. The problem is there's a lot of us who love them, and they're very crowded places. And everyone is looking at each other like they do in crowded restaurants. Are you leaving soon? So this is the poem, and it's about a lighthouse in Ireland called the Hook. It's across the water from Crook Lighthouse. That might be where we got that expression. And it's about the history of lighthouses, but like with all poems, it's about something else. Poems they have their own subjects. They start out being about something, and then they just turn themselves into something else. The Light Keeper. And this for the person who showed me this lighthouse, which he insists you have to go to lighthouses in the middle of the night when they're working, because in the day they're just dead buildings, he said, but at night, that's when they are alive. A night without ships, foghorns calling into walled cloud, and you, still alive, drawn to the light as if it were a fire kept by monks. Darkness once crusted with stars, but now death dark as you sail inward. Through wild gorse and sea wrack, through heather and torn wool you ran, pulling me by the hand so I might see this for once in my life. The spin and spin of light, the whirring of it. Light in search of the lost, there since the era of fire. era of candles and hollow wick lamps, whale oil and solid wick, colza and lard, kerosene and carbide, the signal fires lighted on this perilous coast in the Tower of Hook. You say to me, stay awake. Be like the lens maker who died with his lungs full of glass. Be the yew in blossom when bees swarm. Be their amber cathedral, and even the ghosts of Cistercians will be kind to you. In a certain light, as after rain, in pearled clouds, or the water beyond, seen or sensed water, sea or lake, you would stop still and gaze out for a long time. Also when fireflies opened and closed in the pines and a star appeared, our only heaven. You taught me to live like this, that after death it would be as it was before we were born, nothing to be afraid, nothing but happiness as unbearable as the dread from which it comes. Go toward the light always. Be without ships. And I think I'm closing with, I don't know what to do. I'll give you two little poems. One is Morning on the Island, about the pine beetles. Morning on the island. The lights across the water are the waking city. The water shimmers with imaginary fish. Not far from here lie the bones of conifers, washed from the sea and piled by wind. Some mornings I walk upon them, bone to bone, as far as the lighthouse. A strange beetle has eaten most of the trees. It may have come here on the ships playing music in the harbor, or it was always here, a winged jewel, but in the past was kept still by the cold of a winter that no longer comes. There is an owl living in the firs behind us, but he is white, meant to be mistaken for snow, burdening a bough. They say he is the only owl remaining. I hear him at night, listening for the last of the mice, and asking who of no other owl. And so then, toward the end, I don't have any idea where this poem came from. Sometimes they do that to you. They just are themselves. This is called Toward the End. And I will close with it. In this archipelago of thought, a fog descends. Horns of ships to unseen ships, a year passing overhead, the cry of a year, not knowing where, someone standing in the aftermath who once you knew, the one you were then. A little frisson of recognition, and then, just like that, gone. And no one for hours. A sound you thought you heard, but in the waking darkness is not heard again. 2 sharp knocks on the door. Death it was, you said. But now nothing. The islands, places you have been, the sea, the uncertain, full of ghosts calling out, lost as they are, no one you knew in your life, the moon above the whole of it, like the light at the bottom of a well, opening in iced air, where you have gone under and come back. Light, no longer tethered to your own past. And were it not for the weather of trance, of haze and murk, you could see everything at once, all the islands, every moment you have lived or place you have been without confusion or bafflement. And you would be one person. You would be one person again. Thank you.
Please feel free to ask any question you'd like.
They probably don't have numbers in Vermont, but if you want to ask us a winning number, we're poets and we're very intuitive.
Yeah.
If we knew the numbers, we wouldn't be so poor.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Mm. Vince.
What books inspired you to write?
Yeah. What books inspired you, he said. Having.
What books inspired me? I guess, I was very inspired by Nurkse when I was a kid. And when I was very young, I was very inspired by like dust to dust and ashes to ashes in the Bible, because it was a contradiction to everything else in the Bible, and it was a contradiction to everything that anybody ever said to me, and suddenly it was there. And that says something about poetry, it's like Hinduism ends with like God appears as a dog, which he's not supposed to. In Christianity, Jesus says, "My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" So that this art form is just full of reversals, and that's not a very sane answer, but.
It's a good answer. Well, I was a little bookworm when I was a kid. Because I'm the oldest of 7 children, and it was a wonderful escape to read, either outside under the tree or go to the library or something. So I would take a big stack of books from the library every week. And so I went through all the books that kids read. And that my mother had a typewriter, an old manual typewriter. And it occurred to me one day that I could probably make a book myself, And I was writing inside my head, and then I started doing it on the typewriter, and it became how I lived, this narration always going on in my head. And then there was there was all the language around me. There was a lot of languages in our household, and there was the Latin still in the church, and all of these languages were mysterious and wonderful, and there was a language for keeping secrets, and I just loved the music of it, and I started to write when I was 9 at the behest of my mother, who was going crazy because we were snowed in and schools were canceled and the buses weren't running, and we were all in the house at the same time, which the house wasn't really big enough for all of us to be there at once. So she gave me the job of writing a poem that day, and everyone got something assigned by her. And I wrote a very boring poem about snow, but I was hooked on iambic pentameter. And so which she taught me what it was. And I just kept thinking in iambic pentameter for a couple of years. It sounds nuts, right? But then over the years of being a poet, various poets inspired different phases of my life. So that would be the answer.
Well, how does a poem begin? The Turkish novelist Orhan Pamuk has a scene in his novel Snow where the hero is being interrogated by the police and asked to denounce terrorists. And it's the most ambiguous situation he's ever been in, because he can't stand the police and he can't stand the terrorists, and he says, Oh, I feel a poem coming on. And I mean, I think, you know, you don't know when you begin a poem, but I think poems do speak to, and this was in your work too, is that, you know, we're not necessarily meant to be single people, kind of coherent personalities. We're not necessarily meant to be semi-liberal Democrats who sometimes vote for moderate Republicans or anything like that. We're a lot of contradictions, and poetry accommodates that.
I'm hoping to be one person at the end, like just at the very end, I want to know who I am, just be kind of coherent, to myself. Yeah, thank you. But really, all writing, not just poems, but all writing begins with a word or an image or a phrase, and if you're really lucky, it takes off and leads you. You can't really write, you can't think your way to it. You have to write your way to it. And then there's the process of discovery. What have I done? What's good here? What isn't? That adage someone said once, how do I know what I think until after I read what I've written, So I think that it's all process, and it always should begin in a little bit of unknowing. And usually, if you're lucky, the poem will take over. And it's happening inside you. This is not, I'm aware that, that I'm writing the poem, that it's me. But it shouldn't be a me that I'm very in touch with, yeah.
If I could say one thing too, I think, we're sort of taught that you get an idea for a poem, you revise it, you make it better, and then it's fantastic. And, I really used to tell people, not that I can always do it myself, is that, there's a rabbinical idea that God created the universe as play, and play with ideas. I used to tell people to revise poems the way a cat revises a ball of yarn, because you might want to make the poem wilder. But I think Carolyn was saying too that it's strange how specific poems are. You write about writing into the past with your oldest pen. You know what I mean? There are just so many specific details in poems that make them work as opposed to being wonderful ideas.
I have one question for you. You're both teachers. You both teach writing, Sarah Lawrence and Georgetown. I'm wondering what you think your students are feeling right now as writers, and what your experience in teaching is right now. Maybe different from like a couple of years ago with all that's sort of going on in the world right now.
I'm very hopeful about my students. I'm very skeptical about my planet or my government, but I'm very hopeful about my students. I think they have very open minds, and there are times when they get caught up in things that are fashionable, but I think they really think for themselves. They really care about poetry. So I get a lot of comfort and knowledge and guidance from my students.
This generation is fine. They're good. And they're up against things that we were never up against. And they live in a world that we also live in, but they live in it at the beginning of their lives. And I think they're clear-minded, and I think they want to do something so that humanity will survive. They're very serious, and they're interesting to me. And I'm still teaching, even though I really should be retired. But there's so much that you get from being with them and interacting with them. I'm not ready to give that up yet. So, but you don't have to worry about this particular cohort. They're good, and they are also, I think they're serious people. Yeah.
Thank you.